Hello, thank you for joining us for this panel today about exploring culture in kids' comics. I'd like to start by thanking Comic-Con International for the opportunity and the Children's Book Council Graphic Novel Committee for sponsoring this panel today. We have three amazing creators here to talk about their work, and I'd like to introduce them. I'll start with Rumi Hara, who is the creator of Nori. Rumi Hara was born in Kyoto, Japan, and started printing her comics on a tiny home printer while working as a translator in Tokyo in 2010. After receiving an MFA in illustration from Savannah College of Art and Design, Rumi moved to New York in 2014, where she now lives and works as an illustrator and comics artist. Nori was first self-published as mini comics and was nominated for an Ignatz Award. Jose Pimienta resides in Glendale, California, where they draw comics and storyboards and sketches for visual development. They've worked with Random House Graphic, Iron Circus Comics, Dark Horse Comics, Disney Digital Network, and more. During their upbringing in the city of Mexicali, Mexico, Joe was heavily influenced by animation, music, and short stories. After high school, they ventured toward the state of Georgia, where they studied at Savannah College of Art and Design. Suncatcher is their debut graphic novel as both author and illustrator. And finally, we have Kiku Hughes. Kiku is a cartoonist and illustrator based in the Seattle area. Her work has been featured in Beyond Anthology, Volumes 1 and 2, Shortbox number 6, and the Alloy Anthology. She creates stories about identity, queer romance, and compassionate sci-fi. Displacement is her first graphic novel and is a story she's wanted to share for as long as she can remember. It was selected as a youth honor title for the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature. And I'm Carla Riemer. I'm a youth librarian in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've worked in high schools and middle schools. I'm a member of the ALA's Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable, and I blog about YA graphic novels and books at booksican'tshutupabout.com. So I'd like to get our conversation started just by asking each of our illustrators and authors here, our creators, tell us a little bit about your graphic novel. And anyone can jump in, whoever's feeling brave.
Oh, I can go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rumi.
The first one to speak. The first one to speak goes.
Well, thank you for having me. My graphic novel is called Nori. It's short for Noriko. That's the name of the main character. She is 3 at the beginning of the book, and then she turns 4. The year is 1986, and she is living with her grandmother, who's like her caregiver, best friend, sidekick, everything, because her parents are working full time. Yeah, they go on a lot of different adventures in their small Japanese town. They also get to go to Hawaii, Big Island.
Thanks.
I guess we'll go in the way that we were introduced. My name is Jose Pimienta, and I've been the author and illustrator for Suncatcher. And Suncatcher is the story of a teenage musician who discovers that her grandfather's soul is trapped in a guitar, and in order to set him free, she has to play the song that he never got to write. And throughout this journey, this also begins to cause some friction with the rest of her bandmates. And the story takes place in the early 2000s in the city of Mexicali, Mexico, which is a time when there was a lot of DIY punk shows and rock and music events put together by teenagers, specifically for teenagers. And it's predominantly just with the focus of music and why music is great and why I personally love music, and also drawing attention to this one particular city where I grew up on, that it's a border town, so it's right at the border with Mexico and California. So
Thanks.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kiku. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you, Carla, for moderating. So Displacement is the story of a fictionalized teenage version of myself being pulled back in time to experience Japanese American incarceration alongside my grandmother, who was born in San Francisco and then taken forcibly to a camp in the deserts of Utah. And so it's a story about the power of memory and of intergenerational trauma, and the ways that we sort of reclaim those memories in order to aid our navigation of current events and of the world.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm curious about what inspired each of you to write this particular story now. I love the fact that they're all steeped in culture and are very much tied to culture, but what was it about now in this story that brought you to write it?
I'm pointing at you, Rumi, just because.
Oh, you are.
Just because you're
right, right. I was wondering.
I figured we could go in order that way.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it is a fictional story, but I gave Nori a lot of my memories, and also what my grandma told me. I was born in Japan, mostly grew up in Japan, but also in Atlanta, Georgia. But in Japan, back in the days, it was very unusual for a woman to be working full time after she's had a child, or even after she's got married. And my mom was working full time, which was very unusual, and there was no childcare available. Childcare options. So my two grandmothers stepped in. I had a great time growing up with them. So I wanted to make a story about a little girl growing up with her grandma, how fun it is. Sometimes there are challenges, what you learn from your grandmother, those intergenerational bonding, and how memories are passed on, stuff like that. So that was the starting point of the story.
Okay, great.
For me, it was more like and I know that it sounds oversimplified, but like when I originally had the idea, I wanted to write a graphic novel that was specifically about music, because music was so influential, and it is still very inspirational to me and whatnot. And I didn't know it at the time, but I wanted to figure out a way how to talk about music in this particular way where it's not necessarily just tied to one country or what have you, but eventually, how it was tying up to one particular city, where there's a clash of cultures between the Southern California culture, but also the Mexicali culture. And I wanted to figure out a way of how to bring that visually, without necessarily having to make any reference, without having to make like an explicit reference to a specific style of music, but just have that be the visual content. And during the writing process, eventually I ended up talking to a lot of musicians that I grew up with, and I ended up talking to a lot of musicians who are still practicing musicians, or that were growing up in that scene, where in the early 2000s in Mexicali, and found that there was more than just a bunch of teenagers being teenagers, that there was like a little bit more to it than that, that it was also, we were growing up in a time where there was we didn't have downloading necessarily as an immediate option. It used to take longer. So Mexicali is still it was a small city, to put it in that term. So it was more of like, well, we didn't have that much to do, and there weren't concerts every week. So we had to figure out ways of how to keep ourselves entertained, and music was just a fun way. So those were some of the beginning steps on how to approach that.
Okay.
Yeah. So throughout the book of Displacement, I make a lot of explicit references to the 2016 election in the U.S. Because that really was kind of the catalyst that sort of like how I started thinking about writing the story in this specific way, was really watching, the rhetoric that was being brought up in the 2016 election and throughout the Trump administration, was really, reminiscent of a lot of the rhetoric that was used in World War II against Japanese Americans. And so a lot of Japanese Americans were standing up at the time in the election still, and bringing up these old memories of camp and using them to really call on people to condemn, these sorts of racist fear mongering that was being used a lot, specifically in that election, but of course has always been part of the country. But that was sort of the catalyst for sort of figuring out the structure of Displacement specifically.
Okay, great. So all three books tell really interesting stories. And each of you, despite the fact that they're all really grounded in reality, they all use fantastical elements to tell the story. So for example, Kiku, in your book, we talk about traveling through memories, so not just time travel, but traveling through memories. So why did you decide to do that and to frame it that way?
Yeah, I was heavily inspired. In college, I read Kindred by Octavia Butler, who
Sure.
is a local Seattle sci-fi author, and whose work is, has been very inspiring. And that sort of really showed me the power of time travel as not just a sci-fi trope, but as a means of exploring, one's own history. But what I realized when I was looking into displacement is that even though I wanted to have some sort of time travel element, I didn't have all the facts. I didn't have all the specific details that I felt like I needed because my grandmother died before I was born, so I didn't have a lot of her stories. So I decided to make it more of a memory travel than time travel because I wanted to emphasize the emotion of sort of what emotions are passed down through generations and how we relive those, rather than the facts of what specifically happened, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely does. Yeah, and so Jose, in your book, it feels like a devil at the crossroads story, but in the Mexicali punk setting. And again, why choosing to use the fantasy element to explore the life in Mexicali in the punk setting?
Well, first of all, I want to give you a huge thanks for recognizing that reference, because that was a major part of it. Yeah, I mean, like it's for anyone who's watching it is not familiar. So The Devil at the Crossroads, which is also referred to as the Robert Johnson story,
Right.
it's a very popular myth or legend. I don't know that it's about a musician who who comes to a crossroads and the devil makes a proposition and it takes it from there. So again, like as a lover of music, and also like I believe that it's when I first heard that story, it was like, wow, what a story, right? And then of course you hear Robert Johnson's personal story of like his origins and just his music in general. So I wanted to do something similar to that, just because that entire setup just sounds very timeless and very universal. Of like, what if someone were proposed to you that you could have immeasurable talent at the expense of of something that we are not in a capacity to measure just yet, which in the Robert Johnson case being his soul. So I wanted to do something with that, but I also wanted to be a little bit more ambiguous, and I wanted to find another way to tell it. And to get personal about it, like it's my grandfather passed away also in the early 2000s, and even though I have very fond memories of him, there's also as time goes on, I can't help but to think that there's so much about him that I didn't know. But the one thing that I do remember so much about him is that he loved to whistle and loved to sing. So again, just finding like those little elements and trying to finagle them into a story. It just seemed like an appropriate way for me to find what can be considered some tropes, and what could be like my own addition to it, and what can be like my own part of it, but also what can be reliant on things that are just very common on multiple folklores almost, because Robert Johnson is a very American story, but
right.
It's in American music is a big influence, but Mexican music and Mexican folklore also does a lot of the magical realism aspect to it, or there's a lot of things that don't exactly always translate very well. So I wanted to play with that, and it was a fun journey that way. I hope that answered the question. I think I answered that.
That most definitely answered the question. Yeah, that was fine. And Rumi, in your book, the fantasy is so much fun. I mean, we're pounding mochi on the moon with Nori. We're talking to penguins. So it was interesting how you brought her fantasy world to life. I mean, she's 4 years old, and that's the world she lives in. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose to give so much weight to that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you found it fun, because that was the main reason. I think it's really fun to incorporate kind of a dream world in realistic stories. But also there are a lot of things that you don't understand in the world, especially when you're a kid, but also after you grow up. And sometimes your dreams or daydreaming, fantastical thoughts, it helps you to explain things and kind of help you understand. So that was another reason. Also, I really like no drama. It's a Japanese traditional theater. It's the one where the actors wear masks and move very slowly. But in no drama, there is usually a fantastical element where something is revealed in a dream. So the character, it can be like a traveling monk, and they're traveling through a place, and then night arrives, and then they dream about the past, and something is revealed in the dream. So I wanted to incorporate that narrative structure as well. I think I was inspired by that structure, so I wanted to play with that in the book as well.
Okay, great. And it's interesting to hear how for each of you, the work is very personal. A lot of your personal experiences bound into it. So we talked about a little bit. Is there anything more about any personal experience that you put into the book that we haven't discussed yet? I mean, for example, Rumi, you said you were raised by your grandmas. Were you as fun a little girl as Nori was? Were you also running off and having adventures?
I wanted to, but I wasn't as active as Nori. I wasn't that great as making friends. I think that's why I made Nori that much fun. She doesn't care if her grandma can't catch up. She just runs off, she finds something interesting, and she just goes and checks it out. She becomes friends with everyone. I think I just wanted to be that way, but I wasn't. So Nori is like my superhero version. Yeah.
Sounds great. Kiku, Jose, either of you have a little bit more of yourself put into the book than we might not realize at first?
Well, yeah, I definitely, even though my character is sort of a fictionalized version of myself, part of the struggle with writing Displacement was that, again, my grandmother died before I was born, and she's a character in the book. But I didn't feel like I would be able to write her authentically, especially since you know, I had never met her, but obviously my mom had, and my aunts and uncle had. So I actually, to get around that sort of, I made it my character's goal to sort of always try to work up the courage to go meet my grandmother in the camps, but never quite make it. There's always obstacles in her way to actually reaching that meeting, and it becomes so important to her. But in the end, sort of reliving these memories and understanding the context of the way that my grandmother was living at the time and what she was going through becomes the only way to know her, because my character never actually meets her. So that was sort of my way of getting around that.
Okay.
For me, it was a very fun exercise, and like a balancing act, almost, to like how to be as personal without having to be autobiographical. Like that was a a very big important that was a very big thing for me, because again, like you know, I'm pretty sure that somewhere I could have just written my memories about what it was like to, you know, be hopping from band to band and going to these fun shows, but I also wanted to, like, you know, I wanted to find a way to how to fictionalize, the entire story and the entire scene as well. Yeah, there are a lot of personal things in the book. Just for instance, a lot of the characters are based off of friends, and just like, but not directly as in like, oh, on a 1-to-1 ratio, but rather more, like some of my friends that are very outgoing and always bouncing off the walls and just wanting to, you know, they just can't wait for that Friday for that Friday show. So it was more of like a composite and putting that into one character. Also, I do remember very distinctly when, you know, in the early 2000s, when someone told me like, hey, we should like make a website and put our music there. It'll be so cool. And we were like, who would do that? Like, who wants to go to a website? Like, like who can afford to do that? Internet is a landline thing and they charge you for it. But just knowing people who had that idea, like, but by the time that MySpace was barely beginning to do it, I definitely wanted to add some of those elements. And also just like, I think like one of the most personal elements that I also threw in there is that the grandfather character, in part of his backstory is that he meets his, you know, his wife in the city of Mazatlan, Sinaloa. And that's the city where my parents met. And you know, and therefore embarked on their wonderful life before they moved to Mexicali. And there are like little elements like that throughout the book, but like I think that's one of the details that that just stick out the most, just because it just felt very sweet of like how my parents met and how they got to know each other, and you know, and so on and so forward. So, but yeah. Yeah. So yeah. Well, I'm just kind of wondering, do I just ramble off on other like a lot of other examples, because there are, but we don't have to.
No, that was good. Well, you can always bring them up later if they're like burning and you just need to get them out. We'll be here. We're here for you. So one other thing I was curious about, I know in our library world, as we're reading and looking at books, there's a lot of conversation now about translating versus non-translating language that's not in English, translating it to English. And all three of the books involve either cultural things or specific language or writing that's not in English. And I'm just wondering if there was any discussion, any thought to how you approach that, this making a decision to translate, non-translate, and what you decided to do.
I'll jump in on that one.
Okay.
It was one of the most difficult decisions I had to make is, do I write this in Spanish or do I write this in English? Predominantly because, as I mentioned earlier, because there's such a clash of cultures in Mexicali, English is kind of like this different form of another second language. Like it's almost like there's a lot of adoptions to a lot of Americanisms. Like I have a lot of friends that they live in Mexicali. Spanish is their first language, but sometimes they can't help but to talk in English just because we were so influenced by American television and what have you. So when I had to make the decision of, you know, actually sitting down and drawing Suncatcher, I had to make like, you know, do I write this in Spanish or do I write this in English? I mean, currently I live in the US. It's where I'm aiming for the demographic to be, but it was a very odd feeling all through the production of, I want this book to be in Spanish as well. My compromise, by the time that I was, you know, that I was doing a Kickstarter edition for the book, this is a few years back, I did do a both Spanish and English PDF. But it was also like a big thing because it was at first, before Random House Graphic picked it up. Thank you, Whitney. Before Random House Graphic picked it up, it was a Kickstarter project. And as a Kickstarter project, you also have to think, well, how am I going to afford this? Like, can I print the book twice? So I had to make that decision, and it was a very difficult one. I still think it was the correct one, but I still think about like, man, I just someday. Yeah. So.
Well, you did still leave a lot of Spanish slang in there, so that actually that really helped, you know, solidify the place and the setting. So I hope that made things feel a little better.
A little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, there's only a few instances in Displacement where Japanese is used, and I decided not to translate it. I don't speak Japanese myself. I actually had a friend write it all for me and put my trust completely in her. But I didn't want to translate it, partially because it was a story from my character's point of view, and I don't speak Japanese, and that's sort of a big part of my character in the book, is this disconnect from, you know, Japan, from Japanese culture, from, you know, my grandparents and great-grandparents, and sort of all the barriers that come when that language and that culture is not passed down. So sort of to really emphasize that point, I don't translate the Japanese and have my character constantly ask, you know, what do they say? What are they talking about? And everyone else in the camp around her kind of understands, but nobody's sharing this information with her.
Okay.
That's really interesting, the decision between whether to leave it bilingual or translated. I think for Nori, I made most things in English because it takes place in Japan and the characters are all speaking in Japanese. So English equals Japanese in the book. But when they do go to Hawaii, I thought about like how to express the two different languages flying around. So that was interesting to work on.
I remember how you basically, like you said, you center Japanese. So when people are speaking English to them, it's basically just some scribbles in the bubble, because that's, you know, again, not understanding.
Yeah.
So, you know, kind of centering the culture where they are and making sure that for all three of you guys, the culture where they are is the solid, is the basis, and, you know, they're not othered. It's what you are, if that makes sense. Let's see. I'm wondering what, in the end, you hope that people will take away from your stories, just generally.
I hope it's a fun read.
All right.
Yeah, especially because it came out during the pandemic. And Nori, she's a little kid. She likes to play outside. She likes to run around. And it came out when a lot of kids were, even adults, no one was able to do that. So I hope whenever you read it, I hope the reader will feel a little bit of freedom and a sense of adventure.
Great.
I have an answer for this, but it's like there is something that I do tell people, both in a, you know, kind of a laid back but humorous, but hopefully humorous way, where like I like to say, like, I do think that maybe like the best way to read this book is put on your headphones and listen to your favorite album while you read it. Mostly just because as a huge fan of playlists and mixtapes and mixed CDs, I like that there's like, I do like the idea of reading through something that can also make it personal for you. So, I mean, other than hopefully bringing more awareness to border cities and you know, interconnectivity between different cultures, and just telling people that that Mexicali is a really nice place. Yeah, I do think like if there's something to get out of it, like I do think like maybe putting on your headphones and listening to your favorite piece of music while you read it can make it a very enjoyable experience. So that's where I would go.
Okay.
When I was first making Displacement, my hope was that people would get out of it a sort of deeper understanding of intergenerational trauma and the ways in which everyone in our country, and you know, this being a primarily U.S. story, you know, the country is less vibrant and less rich when we oppress people and erase parts of their culture, and that is gone for good. And sort of the struggle of trying to reclaim that culture, even as people around you are, you know, suddenly so interested in Japanese culture now, that it's kind of, that irony was always very stark to me. But as it came out, I realized from, you know, talking to people who had read it, that a lot of people just didn't even know the basic story of what happened of the Japanese American incarceration camps. There were a lot of people who were like, I'd never heard of this, or I only learned about this once in high school. So I guess now I'm hoping that it spreads that awareness as well. But really the focus of the book originally was more about sort of the lasting impacts and the intergenerational impacts of these big, moments of racist hysteria.
Yeah, actually, I found that something that was really interesting, that you dealt so fully with that, the generational trauma. And, for a lot of folks, we can think about how that affects our connection to our culture or to our ancestors. The one thing that I thought you were really clear on that I didn't, have not often heard in stories like this is the whole dealing with the model minority myth, leading to anti-Blackness. Can you talk a little bit more about why you decided to be so forward with that?
Yeah, that is something that I remember sort of hearing about from my mom, who, is the Yonsei, right? Oh God, sorry, I'm forgetting everything. Yonsei. I'm Yonsei. Mom is Sansei, which means third generation, which was when a lot of, she grew up, sort of in the 60s, a little bit after, but and a lot of Japanese Americans at that time, even as they're fighting for redress and for the government to acknowledge that what they had done was wrong, the way for that was paved by Black civil rights activism. And there is still a lack of understanding, I think, in a lot of Asian American circles about that sort of connection, and that and the ways in which the model minority myth, which came about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, was specifically used against Black American activists as a way of sort of both pitting different minority groups against each other, so that there's less solidarity, which is dangerous. And and that whole bootstraps, look at the Japanese Americans pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, which is not even true. It was, I can't go into all of it, but sorry, I got off on a tangent. But yeah, it felt important. It felt important to bring up because, this whole idea of intergenerational trauma, it also, I think, relates to intercommunity activism and sort of, how we have to be aware of, the very various layers that go into, I don't know, these stereotypes and these ideas. I'm not answering this very well. I'm sorry.
No, you're actually answering it very well. And you're actually leading to something else that I found really interesting that you also dealt with. You didn't just leave it there. You talked about how, despite the conflicts within, and the disconnection from the general community, that when we started seeing things happen to people in the 60s and with the election in 2016, that it brought out a lot of activists, that activism became very strong. So I think, can you talk a little bit more about sort of how you saw the connection between what happened to folks in the incarceration camps and how that led to generations later being activists?
Yeah, I think that goes definitely to one of the other central themes of the book, which is, I think, the power of memory and of reclaiming those memories, even through generations. I think, the power is not just in acknowledging what happened, it's in using your understanding of what happened to, understand your present and understand where you're trying to go as a country, as a community, and as a person. Like, what is important to you, and what the values that you're standing up for and fighting for. And I think, history and memory is important, but only if you use it as a means to, go and stand up for something and fight for something. Specifically, anti-racism would be a good one. But yeah, I think that's sort of, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And thanks. No, that was great. So Rumi, in your book, where we see Nori running around and having a good time and being as four-year-olds are in their own world, we still as readers get to see the experience of the adults around her. And one thing I found particularly striking was when her grandmother, after they won the trip to Hawaii, and the grandmother's talking to the shopkeepers, and they're talking about their experience during World War II and what life was like for them. So can you talk a little bit more about how you integrated that, which is kind of completely above Nori's head, but still is very central to the story?
Yeah, growing up with my grandma meant that every other day you hear about some kind of reference to the World War II and how difficult life was. So if you're not, you know, eating all your food, she'll be critical that you're being spoiled, and she had absolutely nothing growing up. Or the time when she was chased by a small airplane and almost got killed, how she felt at the time. Or yeah, something silly and funny, like you know, eat all your food, to something like, oh wow, and you just remember forever, like right after the bombing of Osaka City, what the flattened city looked like and things like that. So I think it's a very important part of growing up with someone much older than you, and like Kiku said, memories are so powerful. And just by hearing about someone's memory, it kind of becomes part of yourself too. So I wanted it to be part of the story, part of the book. And I wanted the reader to not just read it, but see it. And graphic novels are a great way to communicate that, I think.
Great.
Yeah.
So, Jose, I have a couple questions for you. One, I was curious so we talked about how Beatrice is trying to create this song in order to save her grandfather's soul, untrap him. And you talked about how she gets more and more obsessed with doing this. From an artistic standpoint, I thought that visually you did such a beautiful job in expressing her kind of getting pulled deeper and deeper away from reality and into this quest. Can you talk about sort of what through your mind as you're making the artistic choices and sort of depicting her state of mind?
So I mean, it was a very deliberate choice to, number one, never write any lyrics, because and number two, never describe the kind of music that the entire band is making. Because again, like I wanted to leave that up to the reader, but also, I mean, I guess you can assume that if they have electric guitars, it's probably just, oh, you can get an idea what that sounds like, or do you? But no, like it's I wanted to play around with like the visuals of that precisely because it's a graphic novel medium, so it is specifically a visual medium. So I wanted to embark on the journey of like what does it look like when you're listening to something and then you just start making it go louder and louder and louder to the point that it's just noise and you can't really distinguish what you're actually hearing. So I wanted to play with that. And also one of the things that like one of the biggest compliments and like pinpoints in that I ever took is that years ago I was hanging out with a friend and they made a comment about how they liked my sketches of, when I was drawing like fan art of bands and like little sketches of bands and whatnot. And this one friend of mine, you know, made a very in passing comment, like not like a statement, but they just made a comment on like I like how you draw bands because it just looks like they're moving. And that just really stuck with me of like, okay, well, if I'm good at drawing movement and just keeping that energy, well then like let's play with that and see how we can see how we can use that throughout as a storytelling device or as an element in the storytelling in and of itself. So when the story starts, you know, like, and I know that it seems like a little bit of a, you know, like it seems a little obvious, but like it starts with someone putting on their headphones and like click and play to the tape. And it starts very quiet, but also it starts with just describing what music can make you feel. And then once the story starts going, it also is just like, it starts just being like little symbols here and there until eventually, well, it just gets so bombastic that you really can't distinguish. But and that's also like an element of obsession, you know, where like when something gets so obsessive, the phrase goes, you lose sight of things, so you really can't distinguish what's a positive or what's a negative decision or how's that's going to impact you. So yeah, I did consciously wanted to play with that and use that as a method to, you know, to also talk about like how in the creative process, yeah, it always sounds like like encouraging words of like, you just have to like focus and do it. Yeah, but to what extent? because
Right.
that can also be detrimental. So I also wanted to like, see if I could put that around. So
Okay.
yeah.
And there's something you touched on earlier, but I want details. Were you listening to a particular playlist as you're creating the book? Anything that kind of like music that inspired you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. There was definitely I mean, they're all through the book, by the way. Also, like, there's like a lot of like, nods to bands. This is just a side story, and I hope it, but like at the back of the book, there's like all these. There's this entire list of notes and Easter eggs of just every single musical reference that I made, just in terms of like album releases and like songs and T-shirts and whatnot. So that is all through the book. But like, at some point, like I did make like an official list for myself, and then I made a YouTube playlist for that, and then I made like Spotify for that. But like, we don't have to get into that. But yeah, like, this sounds kind of corny, but I do think that it is, like, to me, it was very helpful, is that I did have a playlist or like go-to albums that I would be listening to while I was drawing it, just because I thought that it was very helpful to get me in that mood. Just for me to be capable of anchoring a tone that I was going for, because I figured that maybe that's where the heart of the story could be, is like making sure that it has a specific or a solid tone. So
okay. Are your playlists still out there on Spotify or YouTube and elsewhere?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so anyone watching this who wants to turn that on with or reading Suncatcher, it's there. Okay, great.
Yeah, like it's but like I said, like you can listen to your own. That's also great.
Okay.
But yeah, like but I did like an official. Yeah. There is an official one. Yes.
Okay, good to know. This is a question I always enjoy asking. I would like to know each of your origin stories. When did you know that you were definitely an illustrator, cartoonist, creator, however you'd like to describe yourself? I mean, either the first time you drew a circle and narrated the text to someone else, or when did you really know that this is what you wanted to do? Jump on in.
That's a good question. I want to know about that too, about other artists.
Go ahead. No,
go ahead.
No.
You're on camera.
Yeah, we should flip coins about this. I don't like. I do remember specifically, like very, very young. I mean, like there are different points throughout, throughout my life. I think like one of the bigger ones was some behind the scenes for, I think it was Beauty and the Beast, is just like seeing people draw though, making the sketches. That was like, oh, people do this for a living. That was one. And then eventually, like once I started learning that comic book artists or comic strip artists were also a profession, that also kind of started helping in. But I think that like the official like note of like, this is what I want, like it's I'm going to, I think I remember this clearly, is well, and I swear this is not a plugin. But San Diego Comic-Con in the year 2000 was one of my first Comic-Cons. Actually, I think it was my first Comic-Con. And there was a booth for a school that had specifically sequential art. So I was like, oh, you can study this. Like, so if you can study it, that means that it's like an official profession. So it looks official. Like, that's what I want. So like, it's, so I think that's like the one that sealed the deal. Like everything before that, I was like, yeah, I've always loved to draw. I've always wanted to do it. Like I love making comics, but like, I think what it officially made it was like, and yeah, it was definitely just being like, oh, you can like, this is a field of study that you can eventually make a profession out of this. All right.
Great. Kiku, how about you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Similar to Jose, like I had various points in my life where I dabbled in visual storytelling, but I actually didn't really realize that comics were what I should be doing the entire time. I would be doing things that were like comic adjacent just for fun. I remember specifically in high school, I made a sort of a visual, I mean, it was a comic, but I didn't call it that because I found these old mugshots of Wobblies, IWW workers who were involved in this big union strike in Everett, which is just north of Washington. And their story was so interesting and their mugshots were so compelling that I just had to draw it. And but it took me until much later. I was an English major in college, so I knew I loved reading and I was so on writing, but I also like to draw the entire time. And then I found a bunch of web comics at one point after college that were doing amazing things, like Sphere Monsters, F-Skin was a big one. Blue Delaquante's Oh Human Star was a big one. Mm-hmm. And these were like comics that were free to read, but people were doing Kickstarters and stuff, and they were having these smaller publications with stories that I had never seen before from all kinds of marginalized creators that were able to like fund these books. And it seemed like comics was really where so many of these things were happening, because it's such a visual medium. People are able to really jump into it really readily. So that was sort of my introduction to comics as an actual medium, even though I'd been accidentally doing them for a while.
Great. Rumi?
Yeah, I always loved to draw since I was a kid, but I didn't really think of it as a career. I became a translator. I was working in Tokyo as a technical translator for a few years. I was translating mostly Xerox printer specifications. So very different. But then in 2011, when I was still in Tokyo, big earthquake hit northeastern Japan. That's when tsunami devastated the northeastern region. And it got me really thinking about what I want to do while I'm alive. And I think it wasn't just me, but for everyone who experienced that, not just the earthquake, but also the nuclear disaster. Yeah, and I decided that I wanted to make comics and illustrations. And then in 2012, I went to SCAD and started my comics journey there. I was excited to know that Jose also went to SCAD. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I cannot believe it, but we are almost at time. This has been such a great conversation. All three of you guys are just wonderful. So just very quickly, do you have any upcoming projects you'd like to talk about? Anybody?
I'll jump in just because I think it has been announced. Before I say that, I also want to say, like, I was very excited to be on this panel because I'm a huge fan of both of yours work. So no, like seriously, like it's I was very excited. So like and I figured I was going to try to play it cool, but no, like I love both your work so much. Currently I'm in the coloring stage of my next written and created graphic novel. Before I talk about that, like I also have another graphic novel coming out this year by Iron Circus, written by Kel McDonald, called Stars Hide Your Fires. Kel McDonald wrote it, and I got to draw it, and Kel McDonald also colored it, and we're very excited about it. But the other thing that I am currently coloring is a graphic novel that is also coming out via Random House Graphic, honestly, that is called Twin Cities, and it's a story that also takes place in Mexicali, and it's about these twins that when they graduate 6th grade, one of them decides that she wants to study in the U.S. In the neighboring city of Calexico, while the other one decides that he wants to stay and study middle school in Mexicali. and because they're living under the same roof, they start, you know, having all these difference of, you know, all these differences in, you know, through the educational system of like, what's that coming to be a contingency. So I'm very excited about it, and like it's another dream project that I'm very happy to have gotten to write and illustrate, and that's what I'm currently working on.
Thanks.
I don't have anything specific to plug. I'm hoping to go more into the sci-fi realm after this. So my next projects are all much more sci-fi, near future, because that is the genre of my beloved genre. So that's all I really can say.
Great.
I love sci-fi too. I'm working on a collection of short stories right now. I'm almost done with the one that I'm working on. But yeah, I tried making a sci-fi story for the first time. The characters are older, and there are some teenagers. I really I got to read some of Jose and Kiku's book works, and it really reminded me of the time when I was a teenager by reading that. You know, like the relationship with your parents or like your friends, and I was like, oh, that's how it was. I was such a jerk to my mom, or so that was really inspiring, and it made me want to really explore that intriguing but terrifying era that's the teenage time. So I love to make a story about a teenager sometime in the future.
Sounds great. Okay, well, I think we have to wrap it up now. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Kiku. Thank you, Rumi. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you spending time doing this. And thanks again to Comic-Con International and Children's Book Council Graphic Novel Committee for making all this possible. So thanks very much. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Carla, for